Hey, this lecture is about privilege by Jim Shepard. And this story, I'm just checking, was on page 260 of Best American Short Stories 2024. Now, this story, things I want you to keep in mind for your reading. First of all, the Johnstown flood was a real event. So Shepard is taking a real event and he's writing actually about some people who are in, the actual record. Some of these were real individuals. And he's taking these and he's kind of creating his primary point of view characters, and then he's adding that more later. As you can see, once that dam blows, he goes through many different point of view characters to give a sense of scope of the disaster and what happened. But things that you should really kind of keep in mind. First of all, the Johnstown flood happened in 1889. It killed 2,208 people. That's 99 entire families, 396 children, and 777 of the victims were never fully identified. This was one of the first major deployments internally following the war of Clara Barton and the Red Cross. She led the Red Cross the recovery efforts, and they spent actually 5 months in the area helping people recover. It did lead to the Johnstown flood because of the way that American laws were and what kind of culpability laws were at the time. No one was actually ever found to be at fault because what the law was, if there was like a structure on your property, like a dam or something like that, and it blew and people died, you could only be found like liable either financially or criminally if they could prove that there was active, like, criminal negligence. That means that, not just like, oh, it was poorly maintained and it broke and many people died, but you were actively doing something to weaken it. You actively did things that made it less safe. Criminally, did something that would hurt, that you knew would hurt people, and you did it vindictively. You did it in order to harm people. So as a result to that, when because the dam owners were repeatedly, taken to court by survivors, and they won repeatedly. Like no one was ever, found to be at fault for this. There was no court case that any of the survivors won against the very wealthy dam owners. And so as a result of this, it was such, an incredible injustice that laws were changed. And now we have a very different system. Like if there is a dam on your property, yes, you are held absolutely liable if that thing goes. Whether or not you were negligent, like you could have been doing everything right. If that thing went and they say like, whoa, what just happened here? They can go and look and say like, okay, you are at fault because this was under your protection. And like anything that where you could have had a reasonable assumption that that thing might go, you are going to be held at fault. And what we're talking about in terms of the Fish and Game Club, yes, wealthy Pittsburgh speculators had an exclusive club and retreat. It was called the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. And Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Carnegie, and many of the other, like some of the wealthiest individuals in the country were members of this club. So when this dam burst, and the people who largely suffered were the poor, immigrant and, communities of color and, very poor communities. They were the ones who suffered and died. The dichotomy of that was extremely obvious. And we can see that Shepard is really kind of paying attention to that in his story. And as he's going through, he's kind of charting these lives that are totally upended by what has happened. And, the people who are going to, truly suffer as a result of this, you can see where he really kind of wants to put my eye. This incident was the greatest loss of civilian life in the US at the time. It was only surpassed later by the 1900 Galveston hurricane and by 9/11. Those are, the only two that have exceeded that in terms of civilian loss of life from a disaster on US soil. So we can see that In this case, Shepard is drawing very interestingly. He's drawing from something historical. You can also see that as part of that, he's kind of writing in a style that is a little bit older. It's a little bit more of the time and a little kind of less what we would see in some modern stories. He's using, the language that would have been more, to these to characters living of this time. So he's really kind of embracing that, this is a kind of a historical fiction that he's writing here. And we see very much he wants me to feel that tragedy in so many levels. He has a very short period of time to make me care about these individuals. And you can see how all of his primary characters do suffer loss and loss that there can be no replacement. The loss of a fiance and the knowledge that that love will never be, replaced. The loss of a wife and sister and family that has been just swept away. And then he does end the story with that really kind of like common humanity and that common kind of like drawing together and taking care of each other. That's kind of like the little kind of soft, light in the darkness of a very dark story that, the the desires and greed of the wealthy have resulted in the pain and the suffering of the poor. And we see how it has hit so many individuals. And we see he really goes through and he wants to show us that loss of life. So this is a very, interesting story in the way that we see Shepard really ratcheting up that tension in the beginning. And the moment that it's time for that dam to burst, this becomes less a story about the three individuals who have been his point of view characters up until that point. When that dam hits, he wants to show us the magnitude and impact. And so he goes through and he really traces the path of this destruction, later kind of picking up again with those primary characters to kind of show us what the results are for them and what they've suffered. But this is a disaster on a community level, and he shows that to us. This isn't a story about individuals. In a large way, it's a story about communities. And he really wants to engage my emotions. He wants me to have this emotional reaction at the end. And you, my reader, can kind of look at this and say, like, okay, did it have that impact on me? Did it hold my attention? Do I have that emotional, reaction and result? And think about when you look at, the essays we've read about, about writers writing about writing, think about what lens would I apply? What would be an interesting way to look at this particular story? But those are the primary elements I want you to keep your eyes on as you're reading Privilege by Jim Shepard. Excellent story. Really a wonderful one for this collection. All right. So we've got, now I have to get back up here. Oh my goodness. Hold on just a moment. Okay. And I've got to pause this. Isaac, I want you to go upstairs and tell Autumn. You can very gently start from downstairs and Autumn, you are not giving anything that's not coming. Okay, Mama, I want to. Yes. So he got Royal B. Guys. And what I want to next tell you is that yes, I love you. I love you so much. You are my little girl. Oh my gosh. Oh, okay. Oh, jeez.